Hello there. Now settle in, dim the lights, and prepare to unlearn everything you thought you knew about the most prestigious sporting event in human history. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling very Olympic today. Tonight I'm taking you to the oldest and most prestigious sporting event in history. That sacred arena where human potential reaches its peak, where athletes are forged in fire and legends carved into stone, where honor, strength, and discipline converge under the eyes of the world. Or so the myth goes. But what if that myth is only half the truth? What if buried beneath the gleam of gold medals and the roar of national anthems lies a forgotten history so bizarre, so utterly ridiculous, and sometimes so unsettling, that it borders on the surreal? What if, in the name of Olympic greatness, people once shot live pigeons out of the sky for applause? What if they fenced with pistols, climbed ropes for national pride, and swam through floating barriers in a river filled with sewage? What if art, yes, literal painting and poetry, was once judged with the same seriousness as sprinting or javelin? This is not parody. This is not exaggeration. This is Olympic history, the kind they don't show you in glossy promos or heartstring-tugging montages. For over a century, the Olympic Games have been a battleground for human excellence. But in the shadows of that battle, oddities have crept in. Events that seem more suited to children's birthday parties, aristocratic pastimes, or late-night dares than an international display of athletic supremacy. And yet, for brief, shining, and sometimes horrifying moments, these strange spectacles were real, official, celebrated, forgotten. This is a story of ambition gone weird, of tradition colliding with chaos, a tale of how the same institution that gave us Usain Bolt and Simone Biles once handed out medals for painting. This is the forgotten Olympic events you won't believe existed, so brace yourself. Because what follows isn't just a walk through quirky footnotes in sports history. It's a journey into a world where the line between genius and absurdity blurred beyond recognition, and where the Olympic torch once lit paths that led straight into the bizarre. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a like, subscribe, or maybe comment on where you are listening from. Now sit back, relax, close your eyes, and we will begin our journey. So are you ready? On your marks, get set. Picture it. Paris, 1900. The world is gathering for the second ever modern Olympic Games. Also, incidentally, the first that allowed women to compete. Flags flutter, fanfare builds. There's champagne, horse-drawn carriages, grand speeches in powdered French, and somewhere behind the pomp and ceremony, the faint echo of gunfire cracks through the trees. Then again, it is not war, not yet. It is sport, Olympic sport. But the victims here are not men. They're not even volunteers. They are pigeons, hundreds of them, pulled from cages, released into the warm Parisian sky, only to be blasted from it moments later in bursts of blood, feathers, and applause. This was real. This was Olympic history. The event was officially called live pigeon shooting, and in 1900, it was as much a part of the Games as the 100-meter dash or the high jump. Unlike modern shooting sports, which rely on clay targets that shatter into dust, this event featured living animals. Not symbolic, not simulated, alive. And by the end of the day, over 300 birds lay dead on the field. The rules were grotesquely simple. Each competitor stood behind a marked line. From a trap just ahead, a live pigeon would be released, flapping desperately into the sunlight. The shooter, shotgun in hand, had one chance to kill. If they missed 2 birds in a row, they were eliminated. In this contest, precision was everything. But so was cold blood. This wasn't about hitting a target. It was about ending a life. Léon de London, a Belgian shooter, was the day's grim champion. He felled 21 pigeons, winning first place and a cash prize of 5,000 francs. A small fortune at the time. He didn't receive a gold medal. Those wouldn't become standard until 1904. But he did earn his place in the dark annals of Olympic lore. A close second was Donald McIntosh, an Australian whose total kill count reached 18. For over a century, McIntosh was celebrated by Australian sports historians as an Olympic medalist, until the International Olympic Committee quietly stripped his recognition in 2012, citing murky records and the event's unofficial status. But make no mistake, the event happened, and it wasn't hidden in some back alley of the Paris Exposition. It was part of the official proceedings, performed under banners and broadcast to guests. Children were there. Nobles were there. Dignitaries watched birds die in droves while holding parasols and sipping lemonade. But why pigeons? At the time, pigeon shooting was a widely accepted elite sport, especially in European aristocracy. It was viewed as a gentleman's game, one of poise, patience, and cruelty. The Paris Games simply extended that tradition onto a global stage. But this wasn't sport. Not really. This was mass execution in the name of honor. And the pigeons? They weren't just plucked from city streets. They were specially bred for the event. Expensive birds, trained to fly in predictable patterns, their doom written in the curl of their wings. By the end, the field was littered with corpses. Blood pooled into the grass. Feathers drifted like ash. A boy with a mop was assigned to clear the mess between rounds. Let that sink in. There was a boy, with a mop, cleaning blood from an Olympic field. However, even in 1900, not everyone saw this as noble competition. Animal rights groups in France and Britain were outraged. Local newspapers published biting commentary about the spectacle's barbarity. Some called it a stain on Paris. Others simply called it what it was, a massacre. But the criticism wasn't just ethical, it was existential. The very idea of Olympic purity was being questioned. If the Games were meant to represent the height of human achievement, what did it say that gold could be won by killing? That same year, several countries began pushing for change, and though it took time, the pressure mounted. By the 1908 London Olympics, live pigeons had been replaced with clay discs, the modern clay pigeons we know today. The decision was met with relief, but also silence. No formal apology, no recognition of the lives lost, just a quiet burying of the past, and the IOC. For decades, it refused to even acknowledge the event happened. For much of the 20th century, live pigeon shooting remained a dark whisper in Olympic history, something half remembered, denied, or distorted. Official records are inconsistent. The winners were occasionally mislisted. The event was quietly omitted from many summaries of the 1900 Games. It wasn't until researchers dug into the archives that the full scope of the event became clear. Hundreds of birds killed, dozens of competitors, thousands of spectators, and all under the flag of international peace. Think about that contradiction. The Olympic Games, born from the ideal of uniting nations in non-violent competition, once handed out medals for slaughtering animals mid-flight. The symbol of the dove, now a global emblem of peace, was once a target. It would be laughable if it weren't so horrific. There are no memorials for the pigeons of 1900. No public apologies. No plaques in the Bois de Boulogne where the killings took place. Even the term clay pigeon, still used today in shooting sports, is a linguistic tombstone, a fossilized memory of a time when the pigeons were not clay. And Léon de London, he remains a footnote, a trivia answer. His victory is not celebrated in Olympic reels or taught in classrooms, but his story matters, because it reminds us that greatness, even the kind engraved on medals, can be built on cruelty. And perhaps more importantly, it reminds us of how quickly we bury our shame. In 2024, over a century later, the Olympics represent something entirely different. Precision, yes. Discipline, yes. But also ethics, safety, humanity. No animals will be killed for medals. No child will mop blood from a competition floor. No pigeon will die for the glory of a nation. But that wasn't always true. And that's the point of this story. Not to mock, not to condemn, but to remember. To hold up history's mirror and see what it reflects. Not just the triumphs, but the mistakes. The Olympics didn't begin as a pristine showcase of global harmony. They were messy, raw, sometimes cruel. And within that rawness lies a strange kind of honesty. Because when you look closely enough, you'll find that the line between glory and horror is thinner than we like to admit. And sometimes, that line is drawn in feathers. Next up, it's a backyard party game, a carnival attraction, something kids do at summer camp. But for 2 tumultuous decades, tug-of-war was an Olympic event, and it wasn't played for laughs. This wasn't about grinning kids in matching t-shirts. This was serious, gritty, raw. It was men in mud-caked uniforms digging their heels into the earth, their muscles trembling with strain, their hands bleeding through the rope's rough weave. It was pain. It was exhaustion. And it was, for a brief and glorious period, the stuff of Olympic legend. From 1900 to 1920, tug-of-war was part of the official Olympic program. Not as a novelty, but as a mainstay of track and field competition. It stood alongside events like the discus and the pole vault, demanding the same level of training, strategy, and physical punishment. For 6 games, it brought together some of the strongest, most determined athletes in the world, and left them bruised, battered, and, if they were lucky, victorious. Tug-of-war's origins go back centuries, possibly millennia. Ancient civilizations from Greece to China included some form of rope pulling in their rituals or military training. It was a test of collective strength, rhythm, and cohesion. Warriors learned to pull in unison, to strain as one. Lessons meant for the battlefield, not the podium. By the time the modern Olympics arrived, tug-of-war had already become a staple of organized sport in Victorian England. Police departments, fire brigades, and army regiments formed teams and competed fiercely. And when Baron Pierre de Coubertin revived the Olympic Games in 1896, he saw in tug-of-war a perfect blend of classical ruggedness and modern spectacle. It made its debut in 1900 Paris, the same cursed Olympics that gave us live pigeon shooting. But this event had no blood, only sweat. 8-man teams faced off in a brutal trial of strength and stamina. The goal was simple: pull the opposing team 6 feet toward your side. If neither team succeeded after 5 minutes, the one who had pulled furthest would be declared the winner. But if the match was too even, a dreaded tiebreaker round was triggered. That's when things got ugly. There were no gloves, no safety gear. The rope was often the same coarse hemp used to tow boats. Hands blistered open, feet tore through thin-soled boots. Some teams would dig trenches with their heels, anchoring themselves in the dirt. And it wasn't just a display of raw power, it was psychological warfare. Teams chanted in unison, screamed war cries, stomped rhythmically to intimidate opponents. Matches were often decided not by brute strength, but by the moment one team's spirit cracked. And the early 20th century's most dominant force in Olympic tug-of-war, the British police. In 1908, London, the gold medal went to the team from the City of London Police, a squad of broad-shouldered brawlers who trained together every day on the job. They weren't amateurs. These were professional grapplers, men who wrestled suspects to the ground and hauled drunks from gutters. The rope was just a new kind of arrest, and they had a secret weapon, hobnailed boots, heavy, iron-studded footwear that gripped the turf like claws. Their opponents, notably the Americans, cried foul, accusing the Brits of cheating by anchoring themselves to the ground. The Brits responded by saying essentially, "Buy better boots." In the same games, a second British police team, the Liverpool Police, took bronze, and the Greek team, poorly trained and outmatched, collapsed during their bout, literally dragged across the field like dolls. But perhaps the most dramatic showdown occurred in 1912 Stockholm, where the Swedish team, lean and disciplined, battled the British in a contest that devolved into chaos. Accusations flew, matches were restarted, a rope snapped, and when the dust cleared, Britain again stood atop the podium, their hands raw but victorious. Other nations tried to rise, the Dutch, the Germans, even a ragtag American squad. But the combination of discipline, brute strength, and ruthless technique kept the British in control, until the very end. Olympic tug-of-war also wasn't without its victims. In 1904, St. Louis, a match was called off mid-bout when a rope broke under pressure, whipping back and injuring several competitors. In 1920, Antwerp, one athlete was dragged so forcefully that he dislocated his shoulder and fractured 2 ribs, but still finished the match. Teams developed brutal strategies, leaning back to the point of collapse, using their lead man as a human anchor by wrapping the rope around his waist, digging their elbows into the dirt to brace against a final pull. There were even allegations that some teams rubbed tar on their hands to get a better grip. Olympic tug-of-war became a contest not just of strength, but of endurance, pain tolerance, and unbreakable cohesion. It demanded not individual greatness, but perfect synchronization. One weak link, and the rope would slip, and the match would be over in seconds. Then, as quickly as it had risen, Olympic tug-of-war vanished. After 1920, the event was quietly removed from the Games. The official reason? The International Olympic Committee was streamlining events, refocusing on individual athletic excellence. But the truth was simpler. Tug-of-war didn't look good on camera. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't fast. It didn't fit the evolving image of what the Olympics were supposed to be. So they buried it. No farewell ceremony, no final tribute. Just one day, the rope was gone. And with it, a tradition older than the Olympics themselves. It survives now only in schoolyards and nostalgia, the echo of a once noble sport relegated to childhood games. But for 20 years, this was glory. This was grit. This was the Olympics. 8 men, 1 rope, and a whole world watching. And now we move on to something that, in all honesty, sounds like satire. A Monty Python sketch. A drunken dare that somehow made its way into the history books. But in 1906, during the intercalated Olympic Games held in Athens, there was a moment, brief, surreal, and largely forgotten. when Olympic athletes stood across from each other, raised pistols, and pulled the trigger. This wasn't paintball, it wasn't fencing, it was dueling, with live firearms, and yes, it really happened. The early 20th century was obsessed with the art of the duel. Romanticized as a gentleman's way to settle disputes, the duel was seen not just as combat, but as a test of character, honor, and masculine resolve. Swords, sabers, pistols, these weren't just weapons, they were tools of moral purification. And in 1906, some deranged IOC member decided to bring that ideology to the world's greatest sporting stage. First, let's talk about the games themselves. The 1906 Intercalated Olympics are a strange beast, not officially recognized today by the International Olympic Committee, but absolutely real at the time. They were meant to be a compromise, held every 2 years in Athens to maintain momentum between the quadrennial games. But what they became was a testing ground for new events, for new ideas, and for a bizarre blending of sport and spectacle. Enter the pistol duel. Officially titled the Dueling Pistol Competition, the event was a demonstration sport, meaning it didn't count toward official medal tallies, but it had all the pomp and circumstance of a real Olympic showdown. Participants were given wax bullets, hard enough to sting, soft enough not to kill. They wore heavy protective gear, padded jackets, thick masks with metal grills, and leather gauntlets. From 20 meters, they raised their weapons, took aim, and fired, not at targets, but at each other. The goal: accuracy, psychological domination. Each bout involved two competitors facing off in controlled conditions. On the official signal, they would fire at each other's torsos. Points were awarded based on who hit their opponent more cleanly. A referee recorded each strike, and bouts continued in elimination-style fashion. The bullets left bruises, sometimes bleeding welts, but they didn't kill. Well, at least that was the idea. Despite the protection, injuries occurred. One French competitor suffered a broken rib. Another required stitches on his neck where a bullet had glanced off his collarbone and struck flesh. Spectators gasped, then applauded. It was insane, but it was captivating. And to the crowd, many of whom had grown up watching military drills and saber duels as entertainment, it felt like a return to ancient glory. Some matches were solemn and quiet. Others were raucous, dueling competitors trading mock insults, waving their pistols like theatrical villains before letting loose. But beneath it all was a strange reverence. They were playing at violence, and doing so with unnerving realism. The event was largely driven by French fencing master and dueling advocate, Colonel Charles Liechtenstein, who had long argued that dueling was a noble art worthy of revival. He believed that by turning duels into sport, nations could preserve their traditions while avoiding actual bloodshed. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he wasn't right either. The duelists came mostly from France and Italy, nations with long dueling traditions, and they brought with them all the seriousness of battle. They bowed before bouts. They saluted with pistols. They even read aloud mock grievances like stolen honor or insulted families to add theatricality to each encounter. It was half sport, half stage play. But make no mistake, those bullets were real enough. Reactions ranged from fascination to horror. Some newspapers hailed the event as a breakthrough, a way to channel aggression into athleticism. Others called it a grotesque circus act. One American journalist described it as a pantomime of murder dressed in velvet gloves. The French loved it. The British loathed it. The Greeks, hosting the event, were simply confused. But for one brief, heady moment, Olympic pistol dueling was the talk of the town. Spectators bought tickets. Betting markets emerged. Children mimicked the duelists with sticks and broom handles. It was sport as theatre, violence in velvet gloves. And then it vanished. The event never returned, partly because of safety concerns, partly because the IOC, still forming its identity, didn't want blood on its hands, even simulated, but mostly because the 1906 intercalated games themselves fell into obscurity. Political tensions and war prevented future editions, and the IOC retroactively erased the 1906 results from official records. Pistol dueling became a footnote, a forgotten experiment in violence and vanity, a reminder that the line between sport and spectacle is thinner than it looks. Luckily for the competitors, it was banned before the inevitable loss of a life. But why did this happen at all? Why did rational people, organizers, athletes, spectators, think it was appropriate to shoot at each other under Olympic banners? Because this was a time when violence was normalized. War was imminent. Europe was a powder keg. And to many, the duel still represented a kind of primal justice, a way to settle matters with dignity, even if that dignity involved wax bullets and cracked ribs. And perhaps, in an age before psychologists and sports therapists, before we talked about trauma and PTSD, this kind of simulated violence was a release valve, a socially acceptable catharsis, a reenactment of conflict in a world marching steadily toward catastrophe. It was sport as shadow, play as prophecy, and in retrospect, eerily appropriate. Just 8 years after the event, Europe exploded into World War I, a conflict that would redefine violence, erase empires, and transform the role of sport forever. Many of the young men who once raised wax pistols on the Olympic field would raise real ones in trenches, this time with no padding, no rules, and no audience. The 1906 dueling event, for all its absurdity, now feels like a warning disguised as entertainment, a final theatrical gasp from a dying age. Today, you won't find a statue commemorating Olympic pistol dueling. It's not part of highlight reels. It's not in textbooks. But it happened, and it matters, because it shows us how malleable the Olympic ideal really was, how the boundary between tradition and innovation could be stretched, and how that stretch sometimes led into the absurd or the grotesque. In the end, it was not a sport that glorified violence. It was a sport that revealed just how comfortable we were with it, and that, perhaps, is the most dangerous sport of all. Moving on, we discover that the Olympics sometimes have been built on paradoxes. None were stranger or more surreal than this one. Solo synchronized swimming. One person in a pool, trying to be in sync with no one. Yes, it really happened. Not once, not briefly, but for over a decade, the Olympics handed out medals to athletes who danced alone in the water. It was part pageantry, part poetry, and to some critics, part farce. A watery ballet that left audiences captivated, confused, or both. But behind the strange name and shimmering swimsuits lay something deeper. A story of ambition, gender politics, and the quest to elevate artistic movement into athletic gold. Before it was synchronized swimming, it was known simply as water ballet. Popularized in the 1930s and 40s by performers like Esther Williams, this blend of swimming, dance, and gymnastics wowed moviegoers with glittering Busby Berkeley-style routines. Entire troupes moved in formation, kicking in unison, spinning underwater like aquatic ballerinas. By the 1950s, the sport had grown more competitive. Clubs formed, choreography evolved, and soon the desire to bring synchronized swimming to the Olympic stage became a full-blown movement, spearheaded by nations like the United States and Canada, where the sport had deep roots in school and community programs. But there was a problem. Not every country could field full teams. And so, in the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, the IOC made a compromise. They introduced two synchronized swimming events, duet and, strangely, solo. The contradiction was built into the title. How does one synchronize alone? The answer, with the music. In solo synchronized swimming, athletes choreographed routines to music, performing intricate moves that required breath control, flexibility, and flawless timing. Leg lifts, egg beater kicks, dolphin spins. Every gesture had to align with the rhythm, each move flowing into the next like stanzas in a poem. The result, when done well, was mesmerizing. A lone figure cutting patterns across still water. A body, both dancer and athlete, gliding through silence and splash. But when it went wrong, when a move misfired or the swimmer surfaced gasping out of rhythm, the illusion shattered. Viewers were left watching a single person writhe awkwardly in a pool, seemingly at war with invisible partners. And the judging, subjective, brutal, often controversial, because solo synchronized swimming didn't just test the body, it tested the patience and perspective of everyone watching. The event made its Olympic debut in Los Angeles. American swimmer Tracy Ruiz took gold, performing to classical music, with a routine that blended elegance and sheer athletic control. Her legs scissored out of the water like compass needles. Her timing was near perfect, but critics weren't impressed. It synchronized to what became a frequent headline. Late-night hosts mocked it. Columnists called it performance art masquerading as sport. Even supporters struggled to defend the optics. After all, the Olympic pool, usually filled with the churn of teams, the energy of races, looked eerily empty, with a single swimmer spinning silently beneath the stadium lights. Still, Ruiz defended the discipline. "It's harder than people think," she said in a 1985 interview. "You're fighting gravity, water resistance, and a stopwatch. Alone. That's synchronization." She wasn't wrong. Performers had to memorize timing cues without any audio assistance underwater, sometimes relying on echoing speakers or bone-conducting headbands to stay on beat. If a swimmer lost track, the whole performance collapsed. Solo synchronized swimming continued through the 1988 Seoul Olympics and the 1992 Games in Barcelona. More countries joined. More routines dazzled. And yet, the question never faded. Why? Why call it synchronized when it was inherently solo? The truth is, the event existed more out of compromise than conviction. It gave nations with smaller athlete pools a chance to compete. It allowed organizers to showcase the sport without fielding full teams. And, let's be honest, it gave the camera something beautiful to film between medal races. But it also highlighted a larger problem: the uneasy place of artistic sports in an arena built on objective measurement. You can time a sprinter. You can weigh a shot put. But how do you measure grace? How do you rank beauty? And more importantly, should you? These were the questions that haunted synchronized swimming, solo or otherwise. By the late 1990s, the criticism reached a tipping point. The IOC, under pressure to trim bloated programs and eliminate confusing formats, quietly removed solo synchronized swimming after the 1992 Games. It was never officially declared dead. It simply vanished. Duet and team routines remained, but the lone sirens of the pool, the women who danced with no partner but the music, were gone. They had twirled, flipped, and scissor-kicked in solitude for the entertainment of millions. And then, just as silently, they disappeared. To mock solo synchronized swimming is easy. To understand it requires empathy. Because what these athletes did, alone, exposed, floating in a vast, echoing pool, was an act of vulnerability disguised as competition. They didn't just swim. They performed. They told stories with their bodies, spun emotion from silence, and tried to make water itself move with meaning. They competed in a space where laughter and awe were separated by seconds, and they did it for gold. In an age obsessed with speed, power, and brute quantification, they reminded us, however briefly, that sport can be soft, that it can be about rhythm, solitude, and grace, even if it's a little weird to watch. So next time you see a swimmer pirouette through open water to invisible music, don't ask why. Just remember that once, not long ago, that was Olympic, and that the loneliest performance sometimes leaves the deepest ripple. Now, as we have all come to know the Olympics, we know that today's Olympic Games are a shrine to physical perfection. Athletes are immortalized in gold, silver, and bronze for feats of strength, speed, or grace. But once, for a brief and forgotten chapter, the Olympics also crowned champions of paintings, poetry, sculpture, music, and architecture. Yes, real Olympic medals, awarded to artists. From 1912 to 1948, the Olympics held official art competitions, judged by panels of experts and governed by strict themes. And the artists weren't mere amateurs. They were professionals, some famous, many obscure, all competing with the same intensity as marathoners or gymnasts. It was a surreal fusion of creativity and competition, and one of the strangest stories in Olympic history. To understand how this happened, we must return to Baron Pierre de Coubertin, founder of the modern Olympic Games. De Coubertin didn't just want to revive ancient sport. He wanted to recreate the entire Hellenic ideal, in which body and mind were equally honored. The Greeks had poetry contests and sculpture as part of their Olympic festivals. So why shouldn't modern games honor the same duality? He believed that sport without culture was hollow. And so, beginning in 1912 Stockholm, the Olympic program officially included 5 artistic disciplines: architecture, literature, music, painting, sculpture. The only rule: all submissions had to be inspired by sport. At the 1912 Games, the first Olympic gold for painting went to Alfredo Gelli, an Italian artist who depicted athletes in a neoclassical style. Meanwhile, Walter Winans of the US took home the sculpture prize, and notably, he had already won a shooting medal in 1908. He became one of the few Olympians to win in both sport and art. By 1924, entries had expanded in scale. Dozens of nations submitted works. Some were bizarre, including a musical composition for full orchestra, written to evoke the tension of pole vault. Others were stunning, like the intricate bronze sculptures of runners frozen in eternal motion. The medals were real, the ceremonies formal, the reception complicated. Art competitions weren't held in stadiums, but in galleries and exhibition halls, often tucked away from the main Olympic venues. Visitors could walk through curated exhibitions of paintings and sculptures, each labeled with the artist's name, nation, and event. Judges, some of them famous critics or museum directors, handed out scores, sometimes after heated debate. In 1928 Amsterdam, The architecture category included full building plans and scale models. One gold medalist submitted an Olympic stadium blueprint, effectively designing the competition space as a competition. But problems persisted. Some entries were clearly the work of professional artists, violating the IOC's strict amateurism rules. Others were suspected of plagiarism. Still others sparked outrage for being either too abstract or not sporty enough. One year, a gold medal for literature went to a dramatic poem about fencing. Another year, an oil painting of a horse race was declared ineligible because the race had involved gambling. The line between art and sport, already fuzzy, was getting blurrier. By the 1930s, the competitions had become a cultural minefield. At the 1936 Berlin Games, held under Hitler's regime, art took on a propagandistic tone. German artists dominated submissions. Nationalistic themes flourished. One sculpture, a muscular nude lifting a laurel wreath, drew comparisons to fascist propaganda posters. Another painting celebrated Aryan physical perfection. Artists from democratic nations began to quietly protest. Some refused to participate. Others submitted deliberately subversive works, layering critiques into otherwise neutral compositions. The Games, once a celebration of universal beauty, were becoming a battlefield of ideology. After World War II, the Olympic art competitions returned for one last time at the 1948 London Games. But something had changed. The world was rebuilding. The focus was on reconstruction, speed, and spectacle. Art felt outdated. Worse, the IOC was increasingly uncomfortable with the blurred lines between professional artists and their supposed amateur competitors. In 1949, the Olympic art competitions were formally abolished. The medals were retroactively removed from official counts. Art would remain part of the Games, but only as exhibitions, never again as competition. Just like that, nearly 4 decades of artistic athleticism vanished into the archives. Today, most Olympic fans have no idea these medals were ever awarded. Ask someone to name a gold medal-winning poet, and you'll get blank stares. The names of Olympic composers and painters are missing from highlight reels, museum halls, and national histories. And yet, their medals were as real as those given to sprinters or swimmers. Their dreams were just as vast, their sacrifices just as deep. Some spent years on a single canvas. Others went bankrupt building architectural models. A few believed they were making history. And in a way, they were. Because they proved, however briefly, that art could stand beside sport. That beauty and endurance were siblings. That rhythm wasn't only found on the track, but in a well-scored sonata. While the medals are gone, the idea survives in spirit. Opening ceremonies now feature elaborate artistic performances. Host nations compete through stagecraft, not sculpture. And the Olympic motto, Citius, Altius, Fortius, is interpreted not just in meters and seconds, but in movement, emotion, and design. Perhaps we lost something when we stripped art from the podium. Or perhaps it was never meant to be judged. But either way, the story remains that once, for a fleeting golden moment, you could win the Olympics with a paintbrush. And now we move on to water ripples under a hot Paris sun. A rowboat floats sideways in the lane. Ropes stretch across the surface like tripwires. Poles rise above the water like jungle gym bars. And at the edge of the Seine, swimmers crouch, ready to dive, not into open lanes, but into chaos. This was no ordinary race. This was the 200-meter swimming obstacle course. And yes, it was once a real Olympic event. It happened only once, in the 1900 Paris Games, which, by now, you may have noticed, was something of an experimental cauldron for Olympic absurdity. Alongside events like live pigeon shooting and underwater swimming, organizers introduced what might have been the strangest test of aquatic prowess the Games have ever seen. An obstacle course, in water, for medals. Imagine the triathlon's chaotic cousin. The course, held in the River Seine, featured 3 primary obstacles: climbing over a pole positioned horizontally above the water, scrambling over a row of boats anchored together across the swimmer's path, diving under a second set of boats and ropes requiring breath control and agility. Swimmers had to navigate these in sequence, all while fighting the river's natural current. This wasn't a pool. There were no lane lines, no starting blocks, just brown river water, floating debris, and a crowd of Parisians on the riverbanks, cheering and probably placing bets. Each swimmer had to decide on the fly how to approach the obstacles: leap, dive, climb, or swim around. The result was less a formal race and more a muddy aquatic version of Ninja Warrior. And the world watched. The 1900 Games weren't held in a bubble. They were part of the Exposition Universelle, a world's fair celebrating science, progress, and human achievement. And in this context, Olympic events were sometimes crafted less as standardized sport and more as public spectacle. The obstacle course was meant to showcase not just speed, but versatility. After all, a real swimmer, at least in the minds of the organizers, should be able to climb, dive, and adapt in open water. Olympic swimming wasn't yet about controlled environments. It was about proving dominance over the elements. In some ways, it was ahead of its time, a precursor to modern adventure races and open water challenges. But it also looked ridiculous. Spectators reported seeing elite athletes floundering over boats, slipping on wet planks, or crashing headfirst into masts. One competitor accidentally kicked a rope and nearly knocked himself out. Another became entangled mid-dive and had to be untangled by officials. This wasn't elegant. It was chaos, wet, wild, and weirdly mesmerizing. The event was won by Frederick Lane of Australia, a name largely forgotten outside niche swimming circles, but a hero in his day. Lane wasn't just fast, he was clever. While others tried to power through obstacles, Lane approached them with calm calculation. He shimmied, he sidestepped, he lunged instead of climbing, conserving energy. His victory wasn't about brute strength, it was about problem solving under pressure. The rare blend of athlete and tactician. Lane had already won gold in the 200-meter freestyle that year, and his obstacle course victory made him one of the first Australians to ever win 2 Olympic golds. But unlike his freestyle title, the obstacle course triumph became a historical curiosity, almost immediately swept under the rug of Olympic memory. Despite the crowd's delight, the event was never held again. Why? Partly logistics. Creating such a course was time-consuming, required heavy materials, and depended on natural water venues that would soon fall out of favor. But more importantly, as the IOC moved toward standardization, there was less room for improvisation. By 1908, swimming events were moved indoors. Pools were measured, lanes drawn, strokes standardized. Olympic swimming became science, not chaos. And an obstacle course, too unpredictable, too unruly, too fun. Though short-lived, the 200-meter obstacle swim planted a strange little seed, one that would later grow into other forms of aquatic adventure. Today, events like military-style aquatic fitness open water triathlons, and even surf life-saving competitions owe a debt to this forgotten race. The notion of testing a swimmer's ability to handle real-world challenges, not just straight-line speed, lives on. Even in popular culture, shows like Wipeout, Sasuke, and Ultimate Beastmaster owe their DNA to ideas first tested in that muddy Parisian river. And if you think about it, today's Olympic triathlon swim, especially in unpredictable open waters, is not that far removed in spirit. Stranger events have made comebacks: mixed relays, skateboarding, breakdancing. Could a modern version of the obstacle swim return? It's unlikely, but not impossible. Modern safety standards, clear scoring metrics, and TV coverage would demand a more polished format. But with the growing popularity of hybrid sports and the Olympics' desire to stay youthful and relevant, a revival, perhaps as a side event or exhibition, might just happen. Imagine it. Athletes leaping over floating barriers, ducking under water walls, scrambling through inflatable tunnels in a gleaming aquatic arena. In the end, the 200-meter obstacle swim was less about competition and more about character. It asked, what kind of swimmer are you? Fast, good, flexible, better, fearless. Now you're winning. It was silly. It was brilliant. And for one golden afternoon in Paris, it made perfect sense. Then it disappeared, leaving behind nothing but stories and the ghost of a man climbing over a boat, trying not to fall, as the crowd roared and the clock ticked toward gold. Another strange water-based event turned up at the 1900 Olympics, hosted as part of the Paris Exposition Universelle, a haphazard blend of innovation and chaos. Events took place in rivers, parks, and temporary arenas, often without clear rules or even Olympic branding. For swimming, the Seine River became the venue. It was murky, cold, and full of debris. Spectators lined the stone banks, and events ranged from freestyle sprints to the now legendary obstacle swim. But one race stood out: the 60-meter underwater swimming competition. Unlike traditional races, underwater swimming wasn't about speed. It was scored by two metrics: time spent underwater. Distance swum in a straight line while submerged. Competitors dove in and vanished beneath the surface. Judges watched from above, timing their submersion and estimating how far they traveled before surfacing, or in some cases, being pulled out. Distance was tricky. Swimmers who drifted off course or turned were penalized. Staying straight in a current-heavy river without visual markers, nearly impossible. Even worse, spectators couldn't see a thing. The entire event happened underwater, making it nearly invisible to the crowd. It was like watching an empty pool and waiting for someone to come up coughing. The gold medal went to Charles de Vandeville of France, who remained submerged for 68.4 seconds and swam 60 meters, the full length of the course, in silence. De Vandeville's performance was impressive, especially considering the murky conditions, but it was also controversial. Some competitors surfaced early due to water quality. Others lost visibility and veered off path, forfeiting points. A few almost passed out before surfacing, sparking safety concerns. And none of it made for good viewing. The crowd had no idea who was winning until the results were posted. There was no drama, no finish line roar, just quiet, wet suspense. One notable swimmer, Peder Lyckeberg of Denmark, held his breath longer than de Vandeville, clocking in at a remarkable 90 seconds underwater. But there was a catch. He swam in circles, literally. Unable to see where he was going in the dark water, Lyckerberg veered off his lane and curved back toward the start, limiting his distance and costing him the gold. His total covered distance was just over 28 meters, not enough for a medal. Observers called it a ghostly ballet, watching the trail of bubbles shift unpredictably in the Seine. It was both graceful and tragic, a moment of great effort undone by invisibility and disorientation. Newspapers of the time had little to say about the event. Few reporters knew how to describe a sport they couldn't see. Some called it a novelty. Others derided it as unsuitable for competition. One French columnist suggested the event felt less like a race and more like a manhunt with no chase. Audience members were baffled. Many assumed swimmers had failed to show up, not realizing they were watching the event unfold. Underwater, without visible movement or splashing, the whole race appeared like a long, awkward pause in the day's schedule. It was a spectacle without spectacle, a sport that defied the very nature of showmanship. Safety was a major concern. At least 2 competitors were pulled to the surface by lifeguards after failing to reappear at the expected time. Officials worried about blackouts and shallow water blackouts, a condition where the brain, starved of oxygen, causes swimmers to faint while submerged. In today's free-diving world, this is a known risk, one that has claimed the lives of elite athletes. Safety divers, oxygen support, and medical monitoring are now standard in competitive apnea. But in 1900, there were no protocols, just a hope that swimmers would resurface. Fortunately, no one died, but the risks were enough to scare off future editions. The underwater event was quietly eliminated after 1900, and it never appeared again. Why? Visibility. With no action above water, it was impossible to follow. Spectators grew bored. Officials struggled to judge accurately. Safety. Prolonged breath-holding in murky water was dangerous. Several swimmers came up disoriented or gasping. Some drifted into lanes, causing near collisions. Scoring confusion. Balancing time and distance proved unwieldy. One swimmer stayed under longer than the winner, but veered off course and scored lower. Ultimately, the event was deemed unwatchable, unsafe, and unmanageable. It simply didn't fit with the Olympic direction towards standardized, spectator-friendly events. Despite its Olympic flop, underwater swimming didn't disappear entirely. It evolved into other disciplines: finswimming, a speed-based underwater sport using monofins and breathing equipment; freediving, a competitive sport where divers hold their breath to reach great depths or distances underwater; static apnea, a still-water discipline where athletes float motionless underwater, holding their breath for as long as possible. These sports, though niche, thrive in specialized communities and world championships, but none made it back to the Olympics. Because the truth is, what happens below the surface rarely plays well above it. Could it make a comeback? Unlikely, but not impossible. In an era of high-definition underwater cameras, VR technology, and synchronized aquatics, a modern version could work as an exhibition event. Imagine an underwater arena with glass walls, live oxygen monitors, and cinematic lighting. Athletes gliding silently, followed by tracking drones, broadcast in 4K to global audiences. Still, the dangers of long-term breath holding and the subjectivity of scoring remain hurdles. And the excitement, still quiet, still invisible. The 1900 underwater event was more than a failed experiment. It was a rare moment of Olympic stillness, where the usual roar of competition was replaced by hush and hesitation. It asked something few Olympic events ever do. How long can you last without being seen? It's not a question fit for the stadium. But in the quiet waters of the Seine, it was once worth gold, even if no one saw it happen. For our next event, we still remain in the water. Picture the roar of engines, the spray of salt water, crowds cheering from the shoreline as sleek vessels slice through waves like blades. Now forget all that, because when motorboating made its first and only Olympic appearance in 1908, it was a silent, soggy disaster. The boats were real, the race was official, but almost no one saw it, and no one cared. Held in London, under skies perpetually on the verge of a tantrum, motorboating at the Olympics was less a race and more a metaphor for misplaced ambition, poor planning, and the eternal unpredictability of water and weather. The 1908 Olympics were already a logistical monster. Originally scheduled for Rome, the Games were relocated to London after Mount Vesuvius erupted in 1906, forcing funds to be redirected toward disaster relief. Amidst this shift, organisers introduced an odd new sport, motorboating, officially titled powerboating. It was a nod to progress, to modernity, to the new century's obsession with combustion engines and speed. 3 classes were created, based on boat size. Class A, over 60 feet. Class B, 40 to 60 feet. Class C, under 40 feet. Each was scheduled to run multiple races on open water. It was meant to be thrilling. It was anything but. The races were held on the Solent, a channel off England's southern coast known for its beauty and its weather. On race day, fog blanketed the water. Rain fell in sheets, wind howled, and almost immediately, boats began to drop out. Some engines failed, others were swamped. A few simply vanished into the mist, never completing a lap. In one Class A race, only 1 boat finished. That meant the gold was awarded, but not earned in competition. The victory was finishing at all. Crowds couldn't see the racers. Spectators stood on shorelines, peering into greyness, hearing engines buzz and sputter without any clue who was winning. Some races were postponed, others were shortened. A few were cancelled altogether. It was a spectacle without spectacle, an Olympic first. British competitors swept the event, mostly by default. Among them was Isaac Thomas Thornycroft, son of a famous shipbuilder, who captained the motorboat Quirinus II to gold in Class B. His winning time? Irrelevant. He finished. That was enough. In fact, in 2 of the 3 classes, only 1 boat completed the course, rendering the entire concept of competition moot. Even newspapers struggled to spin it. One called the races grey and forgettable. Another dubbed it a mechanical experiment, not a sport. They weren't wrong. Motorboats in 1908 were still a novelty. The idea that a self-powered vessel could race was thrilling, at least in theory. The public imagined something like a nautical Formula One. The Olympic organisers imagined mechanical spectacle. What they got was sputtering engines and a haze of disappointment. Each boat was a prototype of sorts, designed by engineers, commissioned by aristocrats. Some were steam-driven, others petrol-based. Few were reliable, and none were tested for a high-speed showdown in the unpredictable Solent. It wasn't just a test of speed, it was a test of survival. And most boats failed. Motorboating also carried the stink of elitism. While track and field, wrestling and gymnastics could be trained for on any field or mat, powerboating required wealth, engineers, shipbuilders, and extensive travel. These weren't athletes. They were engineers and aristocrats in waxed coats and goggles. In fact, critics argued that motorboating violated the very spirit of amateur sport, replacing sweat and skill with gasoline and gears. It wasn't muscle, it was money. One newspaper mocked the event as the Battle of the Bank Accounts. Another said it was the least democratic competition ever seen on Olympic waters. The British press tried to be polite. After all, the home team won every medal. But even they couldn't mask the disaster. Excitement drowned in drizzle, one paper wrote. Others noted that the boats were frequently invisible and entirely inaudible. International outlets were harsher. French journalists called it bizarre and boring. American papers barely mentioned it at all. For the average spectator, it was a mystery wrapped in a rainstorm. They'd come for a race and watch nothing. No boats, no finish, no fun. The IOC took the hint and dropped motorboating immediately after 1908, and it's never been reintroduced. It was, in many ways, the anti-Olympic event, isolating, elite, and invisible. Unlike other discontinued sports, motorboating left no trace. There are no grassroots versions, no federations, no Olympic petitions. It simply faded, a blip in history, erased by water and time. Even now, Olympic historians rarely mention it, and if they do, it's with a shrug, as if to say, yeah, that happened. Let's not talk about it. But perhaps we should, because motorboating at the Olympics reminds us that innovation isn't always progress. Sometimes it's noise in a fog, a race no one watches, a finish line no one can see, and sometimes the only thing more embarrassing than losing is winning when no one else finishes. On to our penultimate event. Imagine staring up at a smooth, swaying rope. 25 feet of vertical challenge. No knots, no grips. Just you, your arms, and gravity. Now imagine a stadium full of people watching you do it. Welcome to Olympic rope climbing, a real event that once graced the world's biggest sporting stage. From the first modern games in 1896 through the early 20th century, this event was as real and as grueling as any dash or dive. And for a while, it wasn't just athletic, it was symbolic. Rope climbing represented discipline, agility, upper body power, a military-style rite of passage. But it was also a spectacle that confused, bored, and eventually embarrassed Olympic organizers. The format was deceptively simple. Athletes faced a vertical rope, usually between 8 to 25 feet high, depending on the year. The goal: climb to the top as fast as possible, using only hands and arms. No legs, no fancy technique, just brute strength and balance. Judges timed each ascent to fractions of a second. Some years awarded points for style, judging how straight and smooth the climb appeared. In others, it was pure speed. It was part of the men's gymnastics program, a reflection of the early Olympic focus on physical mastery. In 1896, the first gold went to Greek gymnast Nikolaos Andriakopoulos, who scaled a 14-meter rope in just over 23 seconds. Only 2 athletes even made it to the top. It was more than an athletic feat. It was a national statement. In the shadow of the Acropolis, a Greek hero conquering a vertical battlefield stirred patriotic pride. Later, games saw a mix of results. In some years, multiple climbers finished within a second of each other. In others, the heat and altitude made the rope feel like climbing molasses. Despite its intensity, rope climbing never looked impressive to crowds. From a distance, it resembled someone slowly inching up a flagpole. There was no motion blur, no height leap, no acrobatics. just tension, sweat, and effort. One journalist at the 1904 St. Louis Games called it a contest of grimaces. Another wrote, "It is admirable in difficulty, but lacking in drama." Spectators would applaud, politely, and move on. It wasn't a race they could track easily. It wasn't a spectacle that told its own story. And in the showbiz world of the Olympics, that was a problem. Rope climbing made appearances in 1896, 1904, 1906, intercalated games, 1924, and 1932. But even as it persisted, it struggled for relevance. By the 1920s, the Olympics were evolving. Cinematic sports like diving, track, and boxing captured audience imaginations. Rope climbing looked like a fitness test, not a competition. The final appearance came in 1932 in Los Angeles. After that, it was quietly dropped. No press release, no memorial, just gone. Rope climbing wasn't invented by the Olympics. It was borrowed from military drills and classical physical education. In 19th century Europe, particularly in France, Germany, and Switzerland, rope climbing was part of everyday training for soldiers and students. The logic was simple. A man who could haul himself up a rope using only his arms was strong, agile, and prepared for battlefield obstacles or rescue situations. Gymnastics pioneers like Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, the father of gymnastics, integrated rope climbing into physical culture movements, turning it into a standardized test of masculine vigor. By the time the modern Olympics launched, rope climbing already had credibility, especially in countries that treated physical training as a national virtue. Climbers came from a variety of backgrounds. Some were gymnasts, others military cadets, and a few were simply raw talents with incredible grip and back strength. There was no universal technique, but top climbers often used the locked arm method, pausing momentarily every few feet to reset their grip. Some slid their hands in alternating rhythms like pistons. But the rule was clear: no feet. Failing to reach the top disqualified a competitor, regardless of time, and a slip could end a climb instantly, sometimes painfully. American climbers like George Iser, who famously competed with a wooden leg, participated in the 1904 edition, highlighting the intense personal determination required for success. Preparation was brutal. Athletes trained on vertical poles, ropes suspended from rafters, or outdoor towers. Some tied weights to their waists, others did hundreds of pull-ups a day. Hand strength, forearm stamina, and abdominal control were key. Climbers worked in silence. There was no fanfare, just friction burns and progress measured in inches. In a few cases, national teams, especially those from Hungary and Italy, built specialized climbing gyms with adjustable rope tension and elevation platforms to simulate real Olympic conditions. For many climbers, rope climbing wasn't about medals. It was about pride, a way to prove discipline, especially when representing nations recovering from war, division, or imperial decline. In the 1924 Paris Olympics, French gymnasts treated the event like a military drill, marching in formation before scaling the rope. It was ritualistic, a throwback to the idea of athleticism as national service. But despite its meaning, it never translated to mainstream appeal. And once flashier sports arrived, rope climbing was judged by a harsher standard. Was it entertaining? The answer, increasingly, was no. Even though the sport vanished, the skills of rope climbing endured. Military academies still use it. Gymnasts train with it. CrossFit athletes revive it in modern competition. it's still one of the best tests of raw upper body strength to weight ratio, a silent measure of who's built to defy gravity. Today's climbing sports, including the flashy dynamic speed climbing events introduced in recent Olympics, owe part of their DNA to this simple, painful vertical challenge. Rope climbing walked so wall climbing could fly. If you visit old Olympic gymnasiums in Athens or Paris, you can sometimes still find the hooks where climbing ropes once hung. Faded, forgotten, but present. It's a reminder that not all Olympic events were built for applause. Some were built for pain, for discipline, for the slow upward inch towards something just out of reach. Now onto our final event of the evening. Take a breath, bend your knees, lock your arms. No running, no momentum, just one powerful explosion from a dead stop, a leap of faith straight from the earth. This was the standing long jump, once a staple of Olympic athletics, now a forgotten cousin of its flashier, faster variant. For 4 consecutive games, from 1900 to 1912, it wasn't just recognized, it was celebrated. It crowned champions, broke boundaries, and became the stage for one of the most dominant Olympic streaks of all time. Then it vanished. Quietly, cleanly, as if the very idea of jumping without running had lost all relevance. In concept, it couldn't be simpler. Athletes stand at a marked line, feet together, and leap forward as far as they can. No hop, no skip, no sprint. Just one sudden burst. Legs, core, arms, everything firing in perfect unison. It's less of a run-up sport and more of a raw test of explosive power, like a frog launching from still water. Judges measure the distance from the takeoff line to the nearest mark made by the athlete's body. No equipment, no controversy, just man versus gravity. No name is more entwined with the standing jumps than Ray Urey, an American who overcame childhood polio. Urey was told, as a boy, he might never walk again. Instead, he became one of the most dominant Olympic athletes in history, and perhaps the most underappreciated. From 1900 to 1908, Urey won 8 Olympic gold medals in standing jumps, long, high, and triple. 4 of those were in the standing long jump alone. He never lost. Observers marveled at his technique. Urey would lower into a deep crouch, swing his arms like pistons, and launch with the grace of a dancer and the thrust of a spring trap. He soared. His best recorded jump, 3.47 meters, over 11 feet, from a dead stop. In an era without professional coaches, synthetic tracks, or sports science, it was breathtaking. Between 1900 and 1912, the standing long jump was held alongside traditional sprints and throws. It was part of the athletic core, an accepted discipline in the same breath as discus or shot put. The competition was stiff. Scandinavian countries, especially Sweden and Norway, produced explosive leapers, but none could dethrone Urey. By the 1908 London Games, he had become a symbol of resilience, power, and purity in sport. There were no secrets to his success, just technique, timing, and unrelenting will. And then, just as quickly as it rose, the event began to fall out of favor. The decline of the standing long jump wasn't due to scandal or safety. It was subtler, a cultural shift. Spectacle. The running long jump was flashier, faster, and easier to televise once cameras arrived. Standardization. Track events increasingly leaned toward dynamic movement, with running starts becoming the norm. Perception. Some began to see standing events as primitive or redundant. Why measure a still jump when athletes could do more with a run-up? By the 1916 Olympics, cancelled due to World War I, the event had already been earmarked for removal. It never returned. After its Olympic demise, the standing long jump lived on, quietly, in school PE classes, military fitness tests, and strength training regimens. To this day, it remains a standard metric for lower body explosiveness. Scouts in football, basketball, and other sports use it to assess raw athletic ability. It appears in firefighter exams, in NFL combines, in elite tactical units. The standing long jump required a special kind of training. Athletes focused on short, sharp muscle contractions, training quads, glutes, calves, and core. Unlike the running long jump, where rhythm and speed assist the leap, standing jumpers relied on pure leg power and coordination. Every detail mattered: foot placement, arm swing, timing of the knee drive. Most athletes began with feet shoulder-width apart, arms extended backward, and then exploded forward in a tightly controlled arc. The best jumpers landed with knees bent and balance intact. No stagger, no stumble. It wasn't easy. It was explosive ballet. And in Yuri's case, it was almost scientific. He was an engineer by training, and he applied physics to every phase of his movement. He didn't just practice, he optimized. Despite winning more individual Olympic gold medals than Michael Phelps, when counting his two 1906 intercalated games wins, Ray Yuri is barely remembered today. No blockbuster documentary, no signature shoe line, just faded photographs of a man in a singlet, mid-flight over sand. Part of the issue is the very nature of his events. Quiet, unshowy disciplines that left no records to break once removed from the games. There's a growing movement, among purists and performance scientists alike, to reintroduce standing events as a true measure of athletic fundamentals. Imagine a modern Olympic showcase of standing vertical jump, standing long jump, standing triple jump, all measured digitally, televised in slow motion, compared across eras. It could be a kind of strength Olympics, minimalist, raw, and undeniably human. In an age of high-tech shoes, springy tracks, and aerodynamic suits, maybe a simple jump from stillness says more about an athlete than any gadget ever could. Yuri's final Olympic competition came in 1908. At 35 years old, he was considered past his prime. His knees were sore. Younger jumpers were emerging. But he showed up to defend his titles one last time. And he won. By 1912, the event was already being phased out. Yuri retired unbeaten. The world moved on. But if you ever want to understand the beauty of raw, silent, grounded athleticism, watch someone perform a standing long jump. There's no build-up, no anticipation. So as we come to a close, what do we make of this strange parade of forgotten events? We've journeyed through the absurd, the obscure, and the uncomfortable. From live pigeons falling from the sky to poets competing for medals. From dueling pistols to underwater ghosts. From high-speed rope pulls to standing leaps of quiet defiance. And all of it, every last oddity, happened under the banner of the Olympic Games. It's tempting to laugh at them, to scoff, to roll our eyes at an era when competitive arts were judged alongside athletics, when dead animals were applauded, and when champions could be crowned for paddling canoes made of solid concrete. But look closer. There's something deeper happening here. Each of these events, bizarre though they seem now, reflect the values of their time: tradition, novelty, imperial pride, spectacle, amateurism, and experimentation. They're not just sideshows. They're snapshots of a changing world, trying to figure out what sport should even mean. Some were brutal, some were beautiful, all were brief. And in that briefness, there's a strange kind of purity, a reminder that the Olympics were never just about perfection, but about possibility. They tried things, they failed, they adapted. That's not a weakness. That's what evolution looks like. Even now, the games continue to reinvent themselves. Skateboarding, surfing, breakdancing, esports waiting in the wings. We're still asking the same question the founders asked in 1896. What belongs on this stage? What makes a sport? What deserves gold? And maybe the answer isn't fixed. Maybe it never was. Maybe that's what makes the Olympics beautiful. Not just the events we remember, but the ones we don't. Because buried in that forgotten soil are stories that don't just entertain, they teach. They show us that greatness comes in many shapes, that history is weirder than we admit, and that glory, sometimes it wears a pigeon feather, or carries a rope, or holds its breath beneath the surface of a muddy river. Thank you for coming on this journey with me tonight. I truly hope you go on to have a wonderful night's sleep and restful dreams. If you enjoyed this story, I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, and maybe even comment on other places you would like to visit, and I'll try and make it happen. But for now, settle down, relax, close your eyes, and drift off. May sound sleep and beautiful dreams come to you tonight. You deserve it.